Thank you very much, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I haven't got any PowerPoint slides about me, so excuse me if I make some remarks to open. And I'll also take the opportunity to comment on some of the discussion we've already had. This is not my first time in Hong Kong. My first time in Hong Kong was in 1978. And I actually did live here for a short time in Shut In when I was in my late teens and early 20s. And my first job was with the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, briefly in Central. And then they sent me to New York, which was lovely, and to the Gulf. And then they wanted to send me to Saudi Arabia, at which point I resigned and married my wife and went to London. But I spent my first 20 years in finance, and there was a very interesting discussion about data earlier on. And for those who are not from the finance sector, the finance sector is an enormous consumer of data. And in fact, it consumes data in order to innovate. And in fact, it innovates in how it collects and consumes data. And so as we're talking about social innovation, I'm really pleased to have a very intelligent conversation on data collection and data usage. Both the reputational risks and the focus on outliers, but also the notion of openness. One of my very valued ex-colleagues is now advising the Minister for Justice in the UK, and one of his jobs is to try and free up data that is owned by the criminal justice sector in order to help private and NGO providers to calculate the risk as they start to partner with government on a major reform of how offenders and ex-offenders are managed and supported in the UK. So data is really, really important. But as an evil banker, we mustn't forget the people part, and I'm so grateful to Lord Wei for discussing the people aspect. Whether we are in the business of doing good or whether in the business of doing business, there is a moral and ethical component, and I left banking some 12 years ago, but I still have many friends in the sector, and it's clear that somehow collectively the people aspect of finance went a bit wrong, and there was in some sense a collective failure of governance. And so as we think about social innovation, we have to hold in tension the people aspect and the science aspect. And so this will be a recurring theme in what we talk about. So I did spend 20 years in finance, and I left that world around about the year 2000, although that was a coincidence. And I've been working in the social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and social venturing sector since then. I know that many of you will have come across an organization called Unlimited, the Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs. And I spent 6 years there from 2004 to 2009. And in that time, I worked with about 250 individuals trying to start up or be social innovators. So I have a very breadth of experience in that very first stage. But I got increasingly interested in the issue of scale. And using my finance skills in the area of social investment. And so I increasingly started trying to address those issues at Unlimited, with some success, but with many failures. And then through my engagement with Lord Wei, or Nat as he was then, joined Shaftesbury Partnership to really try and crack the problem of how do you do scale. And that will be the main focus of my presentation, is the practical issues of scale. Because it's hard. I think this is one of the things that's really important. Social enterprise has become, quite fashionable and trendy and hip and cool. But as I say, it's hard enough to manage to a single bottom line. So managing to a double bottom line is going to be even harder. So social entrepreneurs and successful social enterprises is harder than business. It's harder than charity. which is why I'm a skeptic of the language of triple bottom line, because I think that's just impossible, you know. And so when you're then trying to scale that stuff, you really are you are you're setting yourself a huge challenge. Now, it's said that history is written by the winners, or in another more formal sense, there's a thing called survivor bias. So we talk about case studies where things worked. So in the spirit of humility, I want to say I will be talking about some ventures which I'm very proud of, but we have failed as well, okay? And you shouldn't assume that just because I talk about things which have gone well, that we've never made any mistakes. And indeed, the way to learn a lot is to make a lot of mistakes, but not make them twice. Just one thing about Hong Kong. Obviously, I'm going to talk about my experiences in the UK because that's where I've been operating. I think there are a lot of things which are pretty universal, and I hope that they will be valid and relevant. I don't want to make the mistake of suggesting that you know, Hong Kong is like Britain, but with bigger skyscrapers. You know, it's a different country, different culture, different history. And I look forward to the debate about what can be transferred and what has to be homegrown. But I will say this, in a year's time, I predict that in the UK, we'll all be talking about viruses. And I don't at the moment. And so if any of you visit the UK in a year's time, and they say, oh, we're all talking about viruses, you say, well, it started in Hong Kong. Or if it's SARS, it's Shanghai. So I'm going to briefly talk about what is social ventures. Lord Way introduced the topic. I'll talk a little bit more about that and a little bit about the Shaftesbury Partnership and our model. I'm then going to give two case studies, National Citizen Service and Franchising Works, which are really quite different in their ethos. So hopefully there'll be some different things that come out from those two. And then a bit of reflection on our role, our engagement with commercial sector, unpack that, and then just reflect a little bit more about incubators, which I think is an area of great interest here. And I will draw on my experience of working in an incubator at Unlimited and then Shaftesbury Partnership. I want to make a general point, though. We've talked the first presentation was very conceptual, big ideas, big history, and that's very important. When you come to scaling, one of the key things you need to do is think, will this work? Okay? Can you translate the ideas into practice? And just one final thing about my background. When I was in the financial markets, I dealt a lot with emerging markets. I was involved in taking investors and helping them to invest in markets they hadn't invested in before. And so I learned a lot about the process by which institutions, investors take risk, which actually is not just risk, it's uncertainty, because they don't really know what they're getting into. It's not just that they know it's risky, they don't know how risky it is. And so when I've been more recently talking to think tanks and policy people, I've always focused on, will this thing work in practice, rather than necessarily, can I get the right return on investment, etc. Okay. So in the UK, a little bit more background, this is really just a development of that first slide we saw of the 4 circles with citizens in the middle and social business and government. And as I always say, in defense of the big society policy, that the original paper was big society, not big government. And the context in the UK in the years 2000 through to 2008 was of an increasing state. And some of us working in civil society were feeling more and more drowned out and controlled by the state. But more recently, we've seen a great concern about youth unemployment and a recognition that it's not just money and legislation, but there's a thing called social capital. How many people are familiar with the term social capital in the room? If you could raise your hand. Quite a lot, not everybody. Social capital is something that is still, I think, a minority sport in the UK. And it's really about the value of your network. It's about trust, it's about reciprocity, and most importantly, if you're an innovator, about being able to move quickly from persuading people this is worth a try, to getting them to help you try, to actually providing resources so that you can do it. And then as you move into scale, getting the extra resources that you need to do more of what you're doing. But in the context of youth unemployment, when I talk to all of my friends, and many of them are, bankers, lawyers, doctors and stuff, and say, what was your first job and how did you get it? They will tell you that they did babysitting, or they washed cars, or they cut grass. They worked in the informal economy. And I said, how do you find your customers? They lived next door to me. They were my friends. They were my parents' friends. So that's social capital in action, using your networks and your local neighborhood to start getting work experience. They didn't just go to Oxford, and by the way, you need social capital most of the time to get into good universities. There was also an issue of community deserts. And these are communities which are marked by apathy. Nothing is happening. You can pump money in there, but nothing's going to happen. What the economist Keynes called pushing on a piece of string. And that's because money on its own is never enough. And then there was issues of uneven distribution of capacity, which I'm sure is an issue that you're familiar with here in Hong Kong as well. It seems to be a universal issue. The policy mix led by Lord Wei focused on social ventures as an ingredient in addressing this. And the analysis looked at the barriers to scale. And I'm not going to talk about the barriers to scale, but as I talk about our case studies, you'll see what we had to overcome. Capacity building, and the two sets of intermediaries, and that included social talent intermediaries, so we now have three sets of intermediaries. And I suppose we would, in England, I would call Shaftesbury Partnership a social venture intermediary. So a little bit more about us. As was revealed in the Q&A, we are a private business, so in theory we're for profit, but we haven't made a profit yet, and I don't really expect us to. We've been actively operating since 2008, so this is our 5th year, and we have a 4-stage process of design, incubate, pilot, and scale. A key part of our approach is to look at the whole system of the problem that we are considering. So, for example, youth unemployment is about the education, the labour market, what families do, how young people organise themselves, the whole system. But then, as I've said right from the beginning, and this betrays, I guess, my commercial background, we would always seek to be as close to the private sector as we can be. I joked about evil bankers, but the truth is that the third sector, or the community sector, voluntary sector in the UK, is very cautious about the commercial sector. It often thinks it's part of the problem, and sometimes it is. They're envious of how wealthy they are, and as a result, there are some quite toxic relationships between the voluntary sector and the commercial sector. And I'm a natural bridge builder, I'm a natural synthesizer, and so I've sought to be close to the commercial sector in what we do. And I hope the examples we give some examples, will show that. I would say a couple of things. There are aspects of the presentation that I normally give about what we do, which I'm not going to do now, partly because those topics will be covered by Jeff later on. Okay, so at this point I want to talk about what was the first social venture that the Shaftesbury Partnership was involved in. And of course it's really helpful if the first thing you do works well. And it did work well. The key thing, if you look at youth work in Britain, it's sort of got 3 chunks to it. The first is people who are middle class and well connected, and either through their schools or their families or their communities, they'll be involved in the Scouts. They'll be doing stuff in the schools. They will go on visits abroad. They will be encouraged to do stuff with disabled people. and essentially you will just get involved in community action through the fact that you start with high human, economic and social capital. If you are disadvantaged, if you've had experiences of crime, if you live in difficult areas, then the government is putting a lot of money into funding programs to improve the life chances of young people. And so there is this awful phrase, NEET. Does NEET exist in Hong Kong? Not in employment, not in education, not in training. When my children were younger and I was cross with them, I'd say, "You're going to be a NEET." And it didn't work. It didn't work. I don't know why. But the point is that in between those two groups, about 65% of young people would not be involved in any form of community or voluntary action. They weren't enough of a problem, and they didn't have enough of an endowment. And so they just wandered through life in a somewhat individualistic environment, passing their exams and on a conveyor belt to some kind of job. But what David Cameron and his team identified was that there was a huge loss, because young people are one of our greatest assets in communities. And so the notion of national citizen service was identified, which had three key components. One was a rite of passage. If you go back in culture, there are all sorts of rituals that adolescents go through to sort of say you're an adult now. And we've kind of lost that in the secular West. Secondly, issues of social mixing. And I won't belabor the point because I think it will just come through, and we've already heard it in some of the history of the work of Lord Shaftesbury. But this issue of helping people from rich and poor backgrounds to get used to each other, so they're not frightened of each other. And I tell you, even if the young people aren't frightened, the parents are, you know. And then to create a more universal way that young people could engage in their community through voluntary and community action. So in the first 3 years, we were involved at Shaftesbury Partnership in the design and pilot of the programme. There was an initial policy paper. The first bullet point here is what had already happened. So there had been some policy work and some initial engagement. We were then engaged to do a feasibility study. And the key issue was, how do you get consistent delivery and scalability? And so we looked at the design, we looked at the people, and we looked at the financial model. At the end of that piece of work, which was essentially a consultancy piece, it was a document, and many consultants produce documents which end up on shelves and there's no action. And so the specific proposal was, let's now pilot this. And so the Shaftesbury Partnership created a special purpose charity called the Challenge Network. And I was the first chair of that charity. And private money was raised to run a first pilot where we had 170 young people from London, went on a 3-week full-time program and a further 2 and a bit months, so it's a 3-month program in total. And then the next year we did the same again, but with a larger cohort. So in total, in 2 years, we had 700 young people through the program. And importantly, in the second pilot, we did it in multi-site. So we did it in London and Birmingham. And this is a key part to scalability, is being able to do the model in 2 or more different places. And then we worked with the Cabinet Office when the new government came into being to switch our financial model from private donations to a commissioned program from the government. In the last 3 years, we've been focusing on the scaling up. And there are a number of different aspects in that. And I mean, I lived this throughout, so I'm willing to answer many questions on the subject. It's very fresh in my mind. But the key points were this. We moved from having control over our destiny, we just had to raise money from private people, to engaging with government. And quite reasonably, they said, well, we want to have some other providers, not just the Challenge Network. And so organisations like the Prince's Trust was a very, very large youth charity. Catch-22, perhaps not so well known internationally, but a very large consortium, and other providers got involved as well. We had very difficult discussions with government on timelines. The specific issue, if you do a residential programme, you have to book up your residential places. And we have to pay for those early on. And I don't know what it's like in Hong Kong. I hear you have lots of money, but in the UK, government can take a long time to decide what it wants to do. And it feels it's in a dominant position because they're government. And we had to say to them, if you do not make a decision and pay us, we will not be able to book the residential for next year, which means you are a government in a hurry and you will lose a whole year because a relatively small number of civil servants want to do a bit more research. And that was a very robust conversation, which I still remember very well. And we did at one point threaten to close down the charity because we couldn't justify to our private funders that we spent a year of paying salaries and doing nothing simply because a small number of officials were not moving in line with the necessary schedule. Anyway, we got through that. And we were asked to deliver 3,000 places. So in 1 year, we went from delivering 600 or 540 to about 3,000. So we scaled by 500% in 1 year. And if anybody's done that, it's sleepless nights. But it wasn't just that we got bigger, we were better. The key metric, the key thing that you count in this program is how many of the places that they paid you to do did you fill. So we were funded to do 3,000 and a little bit, and we filled virtually all of them. And I don't know what Hong Kong young people are like, but we actually needed young people to turn up at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Monday to get in a coach and go on the process. And some of them don't turn up. You know? And so we actually learnt to operate a waitlist program like the airlines do, which is very interesting. It had never been done before. Our competitors were operating on average at a 2/3 efficiency rate. If they were asked to do 300 places, they delivered 200. So we were brilliant value for money for the government, and there's a lot of waste in other providers. And I think that this is something that is very, very important when it's scaling. And I talked about data. It's collecting the numbers, fine-tuning the numbers, and really performance managing against those numbers. And as a result, we were able to grow with the government program. Our target was to maintain our market share, which we were successful in doing. And even though each year the provider mix in the whole program has changed, the Challenge Network has retained a market share of around about 30%. And in doing so, we have scaled from an initial 170 young people in 2009 to 11,000 people in 2012. When I stepped down as chair after 3 years, I said goodbye to 170 staff. We only had 170 beneficiaries in the first year. And so that is the story of the scaling up of National Citizen Service and the Challenge Network. I'm a restless individual. I've stepped down. And so we're now looking at National Citizen Service for older people. And I'm mindful that I was given the feedback there's a lot of youth volunteering in Hong Kong. So I doubt that you'll want to do something like National Citizen Service for young people here. But older people, well, we've got more of them, haven't we? And you know, we're all in aging populations, and particularly this part of the world has got a very rapidly aging population. And so we looked at life transitions more generally. Young people go through lots of life transitions, but older people also go through life transitions. Some are voluntary, like retirement. Some are involuntary, like ill health. But we collaborated with Lord Way in a document which you can download from our website on life transitions and retirement in the 21st century. And we're in the early stages of developing NCS for older people. Now, the picture here is of someone who's 64 years old. Okay, it's Rick Wakeman performing at the opening of the Olympic Games. Now, retirement is basically a 55 to 75-year age range. In Britain, 65-year-olds identify with Rick Wakeman. They are not frail people who are just going to be a drain on the government's resources in nursing homes and getting in the way on public transport and slowing people down on pavements. And we have to think about retired people as an asset for the community. And so our big challenge actually has been around marketing. And that's really all I wanted to say at this stage, is how do you recruit a cohort of people who are starting to become, have more time. How can we engage them so that they can make a positive contribution to the issues of loneliness, of health and well-being, and to having an economic role in the community after they have retired from work. And we're working with a number of large corporates to develop that, including Saga, which is very, very well known as a provider of services to old people. Manpower, which is one of the huge employment agencies in the UK, and the Pearson Group, which is very involved in lifelong learning. So that is an example of a citizen engagement set of programs, whether for younger people or older people. It's about how do we engage them in the community so that the assets that they have can be utilised more effectively. The next venture, Franchising Works, is very different. It's much more business-like. It's much more economic. And the issue is, could we come up with a new response to unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment? And the background here is that there was a lot of policy work, which has already been mentioned, welfare to work, as a result of the reduced financial resources and the rising unemployment. And so the key notion was, could there be a different way of delivering unemployment support that brought in the private sector more? And a key notion was of risk sharing through payment by results and social investment, and Jeff will talk more about that. The Shaftesbury Partnership, we came up with the notion of Franchising Works. And I'm glad to say that it was a cool idea. And we even persuaded David Cameron. Well, we didn't, actually. We talked to some of his officials. And then I was sitting in the launch of Big Society Capital, and he gave a speech. And you could have knocked me off my chair when suddenly he said, Franchising Works is brilliant. But the notion was this. How do you help people go from being job seekers to job creators, rather than from just becoming employee number 198? Can they start up their own business? Well, that's very risky. But franchising is a way of de-risking that startup. Okay? And the problem is that you have to come up with the money to start up your business. And as a result, we designed the following concept. And I'm not sure how visible this is, but basically we had to do two things at the same time. We had to connect people with franchise businesses, which is the horizontal arm of that cross, and we had to connect the money. And I don't have time to explore the financial model, but I'm happy to discuss it in more detail another time or later on. But basically we brought together two forms of money. License fund, which is a social investment, and that levers in ordinary bank loans. So we were acting as the kind of equity that supported the debt that would routinely be provided for a business startup. Now, the key thing I want to share about this is we had to bring together some very diverse types of actors. Job Centre Plus is a monster government-run program of engaging with unemployed people and sorting out their benefits and signposting them. I think it's the largest government department, if you exclude the NHS. We were dealing with commercial banks, RBS, HSBC, Lloyds Bank. We were dealing with actual unemployed people, and, you know, they're all different. And we were dealing with an interesting commercial sector. The franchise sector is everything from McDonald's, which we all know about, to an organisation called Business Doctors, which provides consultancy, so it's professional services, to cleaning services. So there's all sorts of different things. But this is, in the jargon, the SME sector. These are ordinary businesses, and nobody ever told them they could be social. So I'm going to sort of speed up here because I've already told the story of scale once. We piloted in Manchester. We engaged with 1,200 unemployed people. And during the pilot period, we helped set up 45 businesses. We estimate that Franchising Works is currently creating 200 jobs a year. We've engaged with 50 different businesses, and we've raised £1.8 million, so that's about 200 million Hong Kong, in investment in the license fund, and that's our war chest to go and help more businesses get start up. We're looking at replicating Franchising Works into Leeds and Newcastle at this point in time. And so that's Franchising Works. And the key point here is, whereas we were focusing on the community sector in the Challenge Network and National Systems and Service, here we've really been focusing on the commercial sector. And that leads me to make a few remarks on how we engage with the commercial sector. I made a comment at the beginning about the toxic relationship between communities and commercial sector. And it's summarized as, by someone in business as, trouble with you charities, you see us as just one giant ATM machine. And what we've done is say, well, we would quite like you to be an ATM machine, but that's the last of our asks. The first one we want is talent. And we will talk more about people. But I mentioned we scaled by 500% in 1 year at the Challenge Network. I am firmly of the view the reason why we succeeded in that is our key leaders came from McKinsey, Procter & Gamble and Google, all of which have got fantastic reputations for corporate culture. And as a result, every time we doubled the staff load, we were able to keep the culture and the effectiveness of all the new people so that we didn't lose quality or we didn't sprawl. And the organization remained focused, targeted, and cohesive. Secondly, we want to borrow and import business practices and expertise. Franchising Works succeeded in large part because of our relationship with RBS. RBS is one of the largest banks in the UK. It's had its problems, and it's mostly owned by UK government at the moment, which means us. But they are the leading lenders to franchising in the country. And we've had the great benefit of Graham Jones, the head of franchising, working with us right from the outset on our advisory board. Another way that we have worked with business is by trading with them and in the supply chains. And one of our ventures, the Social Business Partnership, we have our first partners are British Gas and Johnson & Johnson, both large businesses who want to do something that they can't do on their own, which is to engage their purchasing with social enterprises and the like. And then last, we have been able to secure £500,000 from Johnson & Johnson, which they told us was their largest ever CSR grant. But we wouldn't have been able to get that money from Johnson & Johnson if we hadn't got a culture within Shaftesbury Partnership of really listening to and engaging with and understanding what the core business model and the strategic objectives of large businesses. And as a result, we were able to craft an approach to them, which they just gobbled up. They then went through 18 months of due diligence, but that's another story. So what I've tried to do here is to give you some evidence of how we've gone about scaling, and in particular, the key essence of focusing on people with business backgrounds and partnership with business. And I'm happy to answer questions either in the Q&A or afterwards. Just one quick final thing. The lessons learned is just basically it's hard. I've kind of mentioned them already. I am assuming that this PowerPoint will be available to participants in due course. So what I wanted to do was to talk about deal flow and incubators just briefly. I want to make the distinction between intermediaries and incubators. Intermediaries are brokers. They link stuff together. Incubators create a safe place where you can grow. And we talked about needing to sort of go off into the wilderness. Well, yes, but let the wilderness be a protected wilderness, if that's not too much of a mixed metaphor. Incubators is not just about money, it's about people. My experience at Unlimited and at Shaftesbury Partnership is that it's actually quite a special person you need to operate an incubator. They need to be extraordinarily generous. They need to be extraordinarily experienced. I've already made the point that social capital is important as well as financial capital. Shaftesbury Partnership is now working with Unlimited to extend the offer that Unlimited makes around social capital, and in particular supporting social entrepreneurs to build ties with business, which is one of our key points. But beyond that, I would say that we have worked with different partners in our incubation activity. Unlimited is a foundation. Our Nurse First program is an incubator for nurse entrepreneurs, and we've done that with Johnson & Johnson, a corporate. And as Lord Wayers mentioned, the Cabinet Office is now funding incubators, and we're working with them on our approach to that. So all I want to say is that incubators is something that you can be creative in how you set up incubators, and it's certainly, I would support the view you should have a diversity of them, but don't underestimate the importance of having the right people running incubators. It's not just about money and so forth. My final slide, which I'm not going to talk to, partly because I'm out of time and partly because there's an awful lot of words there, is simply to make the point that there are different types of incubator for different stages of scale. If you're incubating plants, you transplant them from time to time, from seedlings, then you throw out some of them and you put the bigger plants into another incubator, then you throw a few more away and you put them out, and then finally you put them out into the big wide world. At each of those transitions, some will fail. I think an important learning in the UK is that the incubation model for startups is very different for the incubation model for scale-ups. Scale-ups require a much different approach with more professional skills, a different sort of money. And so as you're reflecting, I suppose this is addressed to the policy people here, think about a 2 or even 3-tier system of interventions for social innovators as they move through these different stages. At that point, I'm going to conclude my presentation. I hope that you found it interesting. I've sought to try and recover some of the time, but may not have succeeded completely. But I would just finally say, I'm so glad that we could be here. This is, in the UK, it'd be quite an achievement to get this many people in a room, okay? Certainly in the early years. So I'm really excited to see how quickly Hong Kong is embracing this agenda. And I look forward to the time when you overtake the UK. HSBC, of course, that I joined in Hong Kong, is now a major bank in the UK. It's the only one that hasn't needed any support during the financial crisis. So in some sense, HSBC has overtaken all of the British banks. and I look forward to Hong Kong overtaking the UK in social innovation. Thank you.